Bismillah, walhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam Rasulullah Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I was really enjoying Ahmad's stories, and I'm sure we could have gone on and they were fantastic. It reminds me of a hadith that we have, in the UAE, there are several charities that have boxes in various retail places. And there's a hadith when the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, perhaps 1 dirham will surpass 1,000 dirham. Rubba dirhamin yasbiqu alf dirham. That perhaps 1 dirham that you spend can be better than 1,000 dirham that you spend. And when I saw that 800x figure, it really reminded me that sometimes, investments that you make can really provide you far more than you could possibly expect, whether they be charitable or commercial, as discussed there. So my presentation is on the topic of fostering an ecosystem for entrepreneurial finance, with particular focus on the countries of the OIC world, as that's the focus for this conference. And this first slide I'll go through very quickly because I believe it's well known to all of us why entrepreneurial finance is so critical for the region of the OIC. And the first reason is the demographics. We know that we have very youthful demographics. We have many young people in the countries of this region, and they are entering the workforce. And when they enter the workforce and they find productive ways to move forward, then that means growth and that means consumption, and it's very good. If they enter the economy or they enter the workforce and those opportunities do not exist, then there are serious problems. And I think it should be noted that many of the difficulties faced in the Arab Spring are very much a result of young people not having opportunities and youth unemployment. So it really is pivotal to the stability as well as the prosperity of the Islamic world. Also, of course, we see a shift from industrial to knowledge-based economies, meaning it's, perhaps a century ago or even 50 years ago, the way you would stimulate jobs or try to create employment would be to set up factories, set up industrial organizations, and employ large numbers of people. It's not necessarily advisable as the economy has evolved and moved forward for us to be investing in heavy industry, but rather knowledge-based economies, which often require smaller, fewer, leaner firms like the one Ahmed Bey was talking about with PayPal, Google, and the like. And also, very importantly, the evolving role of government. There was a time, especially in the Gulf countries, when nationals could expect their governments to take care of them in the sense of employment, stability, pensions, etc. That is changing very rapidly. So the governments can no longer absorb into their workforces masses and masses of young people as they used to, and that is creating a need for entrepreneurship. On the theme of this culture of entrepreneurship, there are multiple elements, and really the key point I'm trying to make in my presentation is that it's not one piece or it's not a one element solution by which we foster entrepreneurship, but rather it's a multifaceted challenge, and it requires actions and initiatives from a wide variety of places. So funding is important. I've put it on the slide, and I think it's well known to us. The skills issue of entrepreneurial skills is very, very fundamental. So all the funding in the world won't help if we don't have the skills to take initiative, to form companies, to market them, to manage people. So that's very important. Regulation is also important, and it's been cited in a great deal of literature that elements such as bankruptcy laws have a huge impact on how willing people are to take risks. And if, in certain societies where if you go bankrupt, then it has huge implications for you going forward. Those places are a lot less likely to foster entrepreneurship. It's a well-known expression in Silicon Valley that a lot of companies don't like to hire someone who hasn't at least had one failed startup in his or her past. So the idea of falling and getting up again is important, and if regulation is punitive, it can be very troubling. The last point here is on capital markets upside, which is very, very important, because people they respond to incentives and they see the examples, and again, Ahmed gave us some very good examples of companies that perform very well, and so you can imagine when these young people were developing their companies, they had a vision. They knew that if we are successful, not only will we change the world through our technology and products, but also we will have a very big payout. Our company will be valued, we will list it, there will be private equity partners in between, and we will get financially compensated for this. In many of our countries, the capital markets are not developed enough such that people don't see the payoff. So now if I'm deciding between starting my company or working for somebody else, what I need to weigh is the risk and reward, and if the reward is much less, then my propensity to take that risk would also be less. Very quickly, what I'd like to say about banks is that we should not expect too much from banks vis-a-vis entrepreneurial finance. We've heard a lot in this conference about the nature of banks, how banks are set up, why they're risk averse, but suffice it to say that banks, because they partake in deposit insurance, because they undertake the savings of people, because they're responsible for the payment system, they just can't take very sizable risks for the most part vis-a-vis entrepreneurship. So we shouldn't expect banks to have the risk appetite required for much of entrepreneurial finance. So we need to look at other solutions. One aspect here that is listed is that banks focus on lagging rather than leading indicators, or it says lending, but it should be leading indicators, which means that banks always look at the past rather than looking at the potential for the future when it comes to financing. And that's the nature of banks, and that's to be expected. Governments play a role, but they need the right business models for it. And what we're seeing throughout the developing world, both in Muslim and non-Muslim countries, is that governments are investing a great deal in entrepreneurship and trying to foster youth entrepreneurship, but they often fall into some pitfalls, which I'd like to highlight here. One is the issue of what you'd call moral hazard, which means that entrepreneurs come to the government for funding if they can't get it from anywhere else. Sometimes you can't get funding for your concept because it's not a very good concept. So that you need to avoid that risk of being the last stop that people come to and getting the worst ideas funded. A second point, which again we see a lot in the GCC, is entrepreneurship funds which are funding hobbies rather than businesses. When I say funds now, I'm talking about government initiatives. Which I mean by that, people who are they would love to own a bakery, they would love to start a technology company, they would love to write some software, but it's for them more of a hobby than a real commitment. They keep their day jobs, they do this on the side. It's something that if it works out, they'll be very happy. If it doesn't work out, they're not too fussed. And as a provider of funds, that gives you less confidence that they're going to be committed to the business. The rigor in the selection process is often lacking, and related to that point, these government funds often focus a lot on quantity rather than quality. So their goal is to deploy 100 million, 200 million within a year. So they like to get applications through the door rather than really looking for great businesses that they can fund. So governments can play a very important role, but they have to get their business model right so they don't fall into these pitfalls. Now this slide is a bit more complex than the rest. What it attempts to do is to show where these various actors, the kind of contributions that are needed, and what we're breaking into the basics and the plus, if you will. So what's critical from a basics perspective, and I'm sure Michael will touch on this in his presentation, is you need supportive laws for company formation, employment, bankruptcy. So if it takes 2 years to start a company, or if you can't employ 2/3 of the people who live in your country, or if you can't go bankrupt without ruining your life, then the chances of you becoming an entrepreneur are less. So these are some of the basic things governments can do. But the plus side are the funding for entrepreneurships, as I've talked about, and also policy around local content, SME content, meaning, and this is very common in the oil and gas sector, many of you will be familiar with, where governments require that their large partners take a certain amount of funding or a certain amount of business flows they give to SMEs. So they say that if you have a drilling contract, for example, in Qatar, then you will also take X percentage of your supplies from a Qatari company or from an Emirati company, and therefore you foster those small companies. Vis-a-vis banks, the basics, again, personal financing for entrepreneurs, and then secured financing for businesses, meaning the classic debt structures. But what's more interesting, and we can give examples of this perhaps later, are collaboration with government programs. So what often happens is the government can be a provider of funds, but if they work through the banking system, it's usually better. because the banks have more skills when it comes to evaluation, assessment, and documentation. So we've seen good examples, for example, in Brunei, where our company, Fajr Capital, is invested in a bank called BIBD, Bank Islam Brunei Darussalam. And one of the things they do is they help the government administer an SME fund by which the government does the funding, the bank does the assessment, and it helps ensure that the recipients are the most qualified for that. Similarly, banks can do promotion of business skills. This is very common for large banks to do, where they'll bring in their clients and help them run businesses better. And then other forms of financing that can be based on skill assessment. Of course, when it comes to investors, the basics are that you expect investors to put equity capital into companies. But where the real value, or a lot of the value often comes, is in incubation and training initiatives like Oasis 500, which you may be familiar with in Jordan, is an example of this, where you actually bring people in, you train them and develop their businesses. Crowdfunding, by which you have lots of people through a platform investing small amounts in businesses, is a very nice way of attracting capital for small businesses. And there are other models as well. Last, I'd like to highlight that schools and the media have an important role to play as well. We talked about skills earlier. If you don't have qualified basic skills in your population, then giving them funding to start a business may not work out to the way you want it. Ahmed talked about financial literacy, which is very critical. So schools need to be helping in this, universities need to help in this, and to the degree that they offer management training, entrepreneurship as being included in that is very important. And I have a whole bunch of examples here probably, so what I'll do is I'll just end it here with maybe highlighting a couple of these examples. So on the government side, the Khalifa Fund we have in the UAE, this is an important initiative for funding businesses started by nationals, and it's been quite successful. Then if we move over, EFL, and this may answer the chairman's question to some degree. EFL is an initiative out of Harvard University that has introduced a scoring mechanism for what's called psychometric, so personality-based assessment of potential entrepreneurs, so that without looking at historical data, but rather looking at their skills, their competencies, their attitude, it can say who's more creditworthy than others. And then I mentioned crowdfunding. Oasis 500 is an important initiative in Jordan, and Shakra is an initiative in Egypt, which is a crowdfunding platform. It's compliant with Sharia, and it helps to channel capital to entrepreneurs in Egypt, as well as on the school and media side. I've given a couple of examples. Babson is a fantastic university or college focused on entrepreneurship, and My Bank is a UK entity that promotes financial literacy amongst young people, and is doing a great job in that. So with that, Chairman, I'll bring my remarks to a close. I look forward to the questions and answers.